Good evening. This is Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Bronwyn Bishop, and I'm here with Theresa Alt, and we're talking about the recent Democratic Socialists of America National Convention. Now, Theresa, can you tell me what strategies were outlined during the socialist strategy discussions at the convention?
Okay, well, strategy was the big thing before the convention, the big decision. Actually, the whole national organization of Democratic Socialists of America had spent 2 years working on a new strategy document. We hadn't done this for 20 years. And, well, we had some very new ways of going about it, a whole series of hangouts where 10 or 15 people discussed various topics online, remotely online, and, draft documents went out and got discussed in the various local groups around the country, and then, suggestions were sent in and there were revisions. And then last May, we had a series of regional meetings where people gathered from the region. So for instance, I took the bus to New York and met people from New York and Boston, and I guess it was basically New York and Boston there, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And we had another round of discussions there, and we were linked electronically in an electronic meeting with about 10 other or 15 other regional discussions around the country, and a few individuals who were in really remote places like Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. So after 2 years of discussion, I have to say there really wasn't all that much controversy at the National Convention itself. We actually had one substantive amendment, and it seemed pretty trivial. I wasn't even sure why it hadn't been, just incorporated as, isn't this what everybody thinks?
Right.
And, we talked around the document for a while, and then earlier than scheduled, unanimously approved it. But I guess you probably want to know what was in it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, a couple of sentences that are almost directly taken out of it. As democratic socialists, our long-term goal is socialization of the means of production, the actual transfer of control into democratic hands. And note that I don't say necessarily into government hands, because we could countenance lots of different forms of ownership and control of production and services, production of goods and services. We don't have to wait for state power. We can start to build the alternative right now. And so what are we actually going to do? Well, one thing is educate about what some of those alternatives are. Be they public ownership of things, be they not-for-profit structures, be they worker cooperatives, and the list goes on and on. We're not the only people talking about this. I think there are a lot of people, the next economy or something like that, talking about very much the same things, some of whom don't even call themselves socialists. Another point, helping labor to organize. Definitely, it's about the people who work getting power over their work and getting credit for it. Community organizing. Now, that often means reforms. We're very much into what we call non-reformist reforms. Mm-hmm. That would be a reform that actually changes power relations. Single payer is healthcare is a good example. It's a reform. It brings healthcare to the 20 or so million Americans who don't even have health insurance right now, even under Obamacare, which cut that number way down, but maybe in half of or better the number of uninsured, but they're still uninsured. So this would simply say everybody gets health insurance. Well, that provides a service to people that they need, it fills a need, but also, think about it, it leaves a working person with much more power vis-a-vis their employer. The employer can still threaten to fire them, but it won't mean that they lose their health insurance, that their kids lose their health insurance the way it does now. Getting on to the next thing, building multiracial coalitions that, also involve people of different sexes and sexual orientations, people of different races, people of different languages. We've got to get everybody working together. Another area, higher education and working among students, and that means both getting away from this regime of having teaching done by grossly underpaid adjuncts, but it also means making education affordable. Probably pay for it by taxes, as has been done in many places very well. Work in electoral politics, because that's always the key to so many things. Organize internationally. It's one world these days, especially with trade agreements. The environment. Well, certainly we can't forget that. I mean, if we don't work internationally to bring climate change to a halt, we're pretty much toast. Right. And to get there, we have to build our own organization, DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and more broadly, the whole democratic socialist left. And in everything we do, we always have to keep democracy in mind. Build democracy from the grassroots up. Build solidarity. It's the only way we'll be able to resist the inevitable pushback from the capitalists.
Right. Right.
So that's what we all voted for.
Right. Awesome. So one thing that particularly interested me was the emphasis on basically, a greater emphasis on racial, harmony and all of this, and working on racial justice. And so I'm just wondering, what exactly would you say that the DSA's plan is for working on racial justice on the local level as well as on the national level?
And of course, it will have to happen at the local level. I mean, it's kind of in everybody. What I'm hearing the most about is go find out, who's who in your community, what's going on in your community, join it. I think that's the most basic strategy.
Right.
Take part.
Right. Yeah. Another important thing that happened at the convention was the DSA passed customary priorities resolution, and is that basically?
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about our strategy, then I went through like 10 different points. Well, we're going to go a little crazy if we try to do 10 things at once.
Right.
So, pretty much, and this is every 2 years we come up with what we call priorities, which is basically what we're going to work on first, and also what staff. And we have very few staff are going to, put their time on. And this year, it's Bernie Sanders.
Right.
So that's kind of like number one. And actually, what got number two mentioned was going back, in everything else, be guided by these priorities, by these strategies that we've just spent so much effort discussing.
Right.
A third thing, as you pointed out, working on creating, strengthening interracial, multi-religious, multi-linguistic coalitions, get everybody working together when we have so many common interests. So I think, and of course, if we spend all our time, there's always the trap of getting completely tied up in outward things and neglecting your own organization or your own family or whatever. Got to keep that up. There will be more elections coming up in 2016, and we certainly want to try to make sure that as few right-wingers come through as possible.
Right.
And finally, we want to do a pretty thorough re-examination of all our organizational practices, assumptions, whatnot. Now that we've kind of set the broad outlines for what we want to do, we should take a look at you might say, the smaller details.
So you've said that basically the number one priority is the Sanders campaign. So what specifically is the DSA working on to help build the Sanders campaign?
We're actually running what's called an independent expenditure campaign. Mm-hmm. That's all electoral work is massively technical under federal election law. So for instance, here in Ithaca and in many other places, last summer you would have seen us out tabling downtown in DeWitt Park, at Congo Square Market at South Side, up on College Avenue, especially in fall, again and again and again on College Avenue, registering new voters,
right,
and just getting the word out. It's that what you actually do in detail is going to be different in different states.
Of course.
Comrades in Chicago have just been out with petitions to put Bernie Sanders on the national ballot. But it's not petition season in New York.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, all of that is excellent because I'm seeing a lot of work for the Sanders campaign basically being done online on social media. People are sharing things and everything, mm-hmm. But of course that's it can't begin and end there. It has to also happen on the ground.
Exactly.
So it's really nice to see that kind of work actually being done on the ground at the local level. So actually that kind of nicely segues into basically I'm wondering how is the national leadership of the DSA working to expand activism on the local level?
Well, some of it is by just encouraging people to do it. We've got a listserv where we discuss our activism. People who actually do stuff get on that list and discuss what they're doing and tell about what they're doing. We've put on webinars that help to explain how you do things, or sometimes even give you practice, like practice in a 30-second spiel.
Right.
That can be done in an electronic meeting. Mm-hmm. What else? Speakers can travel from one place to another. We're lots of local groups, and we're linked, and we work together and share our best practices.
Right. Awesome. So one thing that I think that you've said that is particularly interesting is you mentioned trying to make it so that as few right-wingers as possible actually make it through, and I think that's very important because I personally see a ton of left-wing activism happening on all my social media and in the schools and everything, but at the same time we have this big upswing and very almost sort of extreme right-wing thinking also happening. So. And one of the stated goals of the DSA is to defeat the right while building the left. So I'm wondering how does the DSA plan to defeat the kind of the campaign for control that's happening on the right?
Well, I think maybe the most important thing to keep in mind is that, I always love to quote the old Tip O'Neill, all politics is local, or for certain, it's all statewide. So, for instance, there isn't one formula all around the country for how you ought to vote in whatever even the presidential vote is next fall, let's say. If you're in a state where the outcome is absolutely obvious, be it that everybody knows that whoever the Democratic candidate is, that person will win. Or if it's a state where everybody knows, and you can look up the polls about this, that the Republican will win, whoever. Well, that's what we've sometimes termed a free vote. You can vote, for a Green candidate, a Socialist candidate, or write-in, do what, express yourself anyway, you're not affecting the outcome. On the other hand, if you're in a swing state, and I don't know what, let's say by then it's Donald Trump against Hillary Clinton or something, you may not like Hillary Clinton, but there's a difference.
Of course.
Of course, different individuals will, even within the organization, will come to have different tolerances and different conclusions.
Yeah. This is something I've always been curious about. Is what's your suggestion for if someone say is in a swing state? I mean, I personally am from not only a swing state but a swing district within the swing state of Pennsylvania. So if you are someone who lives in one of those areas and you really don't like the Democratic candidate, but you obviously don't want the Republican to win, would your suggestion to be just go with the Democratic candidate or try and vote for someone else?
I think my personal, and this is more personal, maybe I should say more personal than organizational. My personal would be, under those circumstances, go with the Democratic candidate because, boy, it could, and, tell your friends, that could swing an awful lot.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So something particularly interesting that I think happened at the convention was there were some workshops, one particular workshop being the one on non-Eurocentric socialism.
Yes.
Can you tell me about something that was discussed at that workshop?
Well, that was a real highlight for me. There are actually two different very important topics. In one, Jared Abbott, a young political scientist, talked about how participatory budgeting was a concept that started in Brazil and spread to to other places in Latin America, is very much used in some cities in Brazil, and the concept has come to the United States. And people are experimenting with it in the United States as well. The idea is to bring people in a community or in a neighborhood together with not doing the full municipal budget, but getting to actually make decisions about a part of the municipal budget. And I want to hear more and more about it because there wasn't nearly enough time.
Right.
A second one, and by the way, the other presentation by another young, I guess, graduate student now, Dustin Guastella, was actually a U.S. example, but from the history of the Black Panther Party.
Yes.
And about their programs for bringing medical assistance into poor communities and going around door to door and talking to people about their health problems, but also about politics.
Right.
Something I hadn't known about, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the narrative that we're given about groups like that, especially the Black Panther Party, you wouldn't necessarily think about something like that.
Yeah,
but that's
I hadn't
really
realized. Yeah.
Another panel that happened at the convention was one about socialism across generations. So do you think the DSA has a plan for like recruiting younger socialists, or how is that going to work?
Well, certainly we actually have what we used to call a youth section. Now it's called Young Democratic Socialists. Although that was a bit of an attempt to make them more separate, and now I think it's to be more together again.
Right.
But, there are campus chapters and there are some high school chapters. Basically, you go to the website, you get interested, you contact the national office, and they'll send you some information about how to start a chapter. So I guess that's, you might say, in terms of organizational strategy, that's the main thing. That panel actually was more just about people telling their stories. So there were about 3 people who, you could say, loosely speaking, were my generation. And the moderator is about 10, 12 years younger than I am. And then there was someone from Generation X, and the millennial, and a student, an undergraduate. The stories were not, I wouldn't say the stories were terribly dramatic. A lot of people, were sort of came out of liberal or progressive or labor backgrounds, and usually didn't identify as socialists till some point later in life.
So I just want to go back to what we've been talking about racial justice, because I'm interested in the fact that some people have said that the Sanders campaign doesn't have enough of a connection with that. Was that something that was discussed at all?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But I must say, actually, at about the same time, we brought out a pamphlet about Sanders and matters of racial justice, in which somebody had bothered to sort of go through all his materials and come up with all the suggestions, and program that and there's a terrific lot of stuff there, on issues that are of concern to racial minorities, and the privatization of prisons, he suggests. Yeah. That's what he would work toward. Cameras on cops. We're working on that here in the city and the county, but this would be pushing it nationally, immigration reform.
So one interesting thing that took place during the convention was there was a debate on international resolutions. Can you tell me anything about that?
Yes. Well, this was the one point of contention that we had going into the convention. The one issue that actually required a counted vote. For many decades, as long as I can remember, Democratic Socialists of America has been a member of the Socialist International, together with parties like the British Labour Party and the French Socialist Party and parties all over you've probably never heard of. And a general trend, this was great in the 1980s, and maybe even in the 1990s, when more parties from more different countries started coming into the Socialist International. But more recently, we've seen a trend for a lot of these parties, of the parties that are members, to drift toward the right, toward privatization, toward what's called neoliberalism, which is, in the American vernacular, is more conservatism or business interests. And often new parties on the left cropping up that are outside the Socialist International. I believe Greece is an example. I believe the Greek Socialist Party, which is really has been part of the whole European thing, is in it, and Syriza is outside. And there was a big push by some young people that we just ought to get out of the Socialist International ASAP, right away. And there was also an argument that, well, we really ought to discuss what we want to do internationally before we cut our ties. Although we probably will leave, and we should have a good discussion and vote on it in 2 years. Mm-hmm. It was, not a squeaker, but a fairly close vote, and discuss first, vote afterwards won.
Right. So what would you say was, just real quickly, what would you say was basically like the outcome of the debate?
You mean of this particular debate?
Yeah.
Well, the outcome is we do intend, among other things, to have a 2-year discussion about what we want to do internationally, how we want to relate to like-minded people and groups in other countries.
So we're coming to the end of our time here. So I'm curious about how this convention was similar to previous ones and how it was different.
Well, one just physical difference is that in the past they'd been often in large metropolitan areas with big outreach events, and this one was in a rural place, far from anywhere, rural Pennsylvania, in fact, and more inwardly focused with the big discussion about strategy. And over the years, I remember 30 years ago, conventions were really contentious, but people have been getting more and more friendly toward one another. This one was really friendly.
That's really great. That's really great to hear. So just to wrap up, what would you say was your most striking memory about the convention?
Well, at the very end, we always sing the Internationale, and this sounded more powerful than I had heard it in years.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Bronwyn Bishop, and I've been speaking with Theresa Alt about the recent Democratic Socialists of America National Convention. Good night.